Hey traders, welcome back to the weekly Forex Forecast. Last week was a huge week for risk event and the US dollar got hit with three dovish catalysts. First, a softer CPI on Tuesday. Then we had FOMC where interest rates were held. However, rate cuts were added in 1 year out in 2024. And then on Thursday, we had the ECB and the Bank of England taking rate cuts off the table, at least rhetorically. And this, of course, is de facto bearish for the dollar. So we had a huge sell-off in the dollar last week. On Thursday evening, we got the data to say there was 70% chance of pausing or reversing higher. We did rally sharply higher on the Friday, and we also traded below the 102 level. This was where I highlighted previously that when we have a peak in yields pre-recession, you tend to get a sell-off in the dollar of about 5%, and now we're in that kind of range. So going into next week, I do still favor the US dollar to the downside as one of the best plays. However, just note we are starting to get into that zone where we can see the dollar moving higher, probably in January, on more of a flight to safety as the data starts to deteriorate in the US and globally. So if you have a look at the scores for the coming week, and the first thing to note is that we don't have really any news events that we need to pay attention to in terms of short-term trading coming up. A lot of data came out last week. We have a pretty clear run at the markets. The second thing is that there is not going to be a weekly Forex forecast next Saturday. That is the week before Christmas, and of course we're going to be away over Christmas. However, there is planned for the next weekly Forex forecast to be on the 30th of December for the first week in January. So no weekly Forex forecast next week, guys. With that said, the New Zealand dollar is still looking like one of the best plays going into this week. And alongside that, to the upside, I do like the Japanese yen. The Japanese yen is now, after a long period in the negative side of the scorecards, the Japanese yen now is telling us we should start to look at this. And you can see one of the things about the Japanese yen as well is that it's starting to emerge as a potentially strong market here. So basically anything that starts to pass above 25% and we start to see the net performance getting stronger, it's telling us pay attention to this because this is a market that is attempting to get bullish and enter into a bullish trend soon. So we want to be ahead of that, and I do like yen long plays heading into this week. The only thing to pay attention to here is that we do have in the yen a 95% chance of pausing or reversing, and the last time we saw this, we did actually snap back. So I do think going into next week, first and foremost, we need to see a pause in the yen. You can see the last time we saw this in the fear and greed meter over here was over here, right over here. This is where we got this in this area here, this day. And immediately we got that data this evening here, on this evening of this day, and we snapped back over the next 2 days. So pay attention to this because this is telling us we have extreme greed coming into the yen, and in all probability we need to pause at least first or reverse. So I do think the yen is going to be good for longs, but I wouldn't get involved straight off the bat because this is telling us, you know, if you get involved to the long side here on the yen, you could have 1 or 2 days down like this and you're basically going to be on the wrong side of that. So very much like over in this area, let the market correct or pause first and then look to get involved in the Japanese yen. So I like yen to the upside, but there's a timing factor here as well that you need to pay attention to, not from the open going into next week. So both the New Zealand dollar to the upside and the yen to the upside are my two favorite longs going into next week. The third long I would be looking at here is the Swiss franc to the upside. It's not as good as the New Zealand and the yen because we do not have the trend. It's actually absolutely performing well, but it's actually starting to move in the wrong direction. So I will be looking at Swiss franc longs as well. However, the New Zealand and the yen are my primary long currencies that I'll be looking for this week. And alongside that, it is the US dollar, especially after the dovish catalyst last week. Even if we are going to start to reverse, it does look like we might have a little bit more downside first, at least into the end of the month. And therefore, the US dollar is the top short going into next week. We also have the euro down here, and the euro is the second short position I like, and then followed by the pound. So we're going to be looking at primarily New Zealand dollar to the upside, US dollar yen to the downside, and US dollar Swiss franc to the downside, followed by Euro New Zealand to the downside, Euro yen to the downside, Euro franc to the downside. And we're also going to look at pound New Zealand to the downside, pound yen to the downside, and also pound franc to the downside. Before we move on to the watch list, guys, just remember there is only 2 weeks left to get 12 months free access to HedgeDash by the time it goes live in January. All current members of GMT and anybody who signs up in December will get 12 months free access to HedgeDash for the next year. For those of you that are interested, you can click the link in the description below, and you can click the link in the pinned comment below for more information. Okay, so the first market we're going to look at, as always, is crude oil. Now, crude oil is still a good short, and there's been a market to the short side we've been looking at in previous videos. However, just take note that on a weekly time horizon, this move to the downside is looking a little bit, we're starting to see fear coming into the market here. And very often when we see that, it's telling you this is kind of getting crowded over a weekly time horizon. So for that reason, I wouldn't be surprised, although this is a pretty good short, to see this actually snapping back a bit. And if I am going to get involved in shorts, probably from the upper bound in this area, this is where I'd favor them next week. Just as an example, you can see on the 12th, right down here, once we got this close, on the evening of the 12th, we got the data say 70% chance of pausing or reversing higher. And you can see the following 2 days, we snapped back higher. So this is what you can expect to see potentially over the next week or so. So again, if you get involved down near the lows in crude oil, this could actually snap back. It's telling you the probabilities are 70% chance of this kind of pausing or reversing higher. So I do like crude oil shorts. Perhaps they're not as good as they were previously because of this. It's starting to become a bit crowded. So what I would like to see is if we can pull back in this market first, and we can come back and we can test the prior lows over here, and at the same time breach the 74.91, this would be an area where I would consider a near-term short in crude oil next week. But again, jumping in down the middle here, you do face the risk of this pushing higher during the first half of the week next week. So the first Forex pair we're going to look at is euro-dollar. Now, this is not my favorite market. In fact, this is a market that is probably going to range, and on balance, I think we're going to see a retest of this high and also this high. Probably next week, maybe over the next couple of weeks, but probably next week. You can see we have very, very strong momentum. And again, I think we could use this to also kind of time potentially the dollar index bottoming. And again, that would be once we start to breach this high, especially if we do it next week and we start to push above the 1.09917. So I don't think this market is going to show any real directional move next week, but what I'd like to see is any pullback. I am going to be looking for this market to either break out and push into the prior high above the 1.09920, let's say. And I do think we're going to test this high, so I'd be looking for this market to do this. Once we test this, I think this market is at risk of going back into a range. Why? Because both the euro and the dollar are the two weakest markets. So I'm not necessarily looking to trade this, but we cover euro dollar every week, and I do think it's a good barometer going into next week of what we're likely to see, i.e. dollar shorts actually being the better opportunities as we push higher into this high. And then once we push above the 1.09920 and we take out this high, I then think we're going to reverse lower, and that's when euro shorts will probably become the better option next week out of the two. So that's what I'm looking for next week in euro dollar. Probably won't trade this market itself, but keep an eye out for the rally into the high over here and then a potential reversal. So the first Forex pair that I do like going into next week after euro dollar, which of course is just two weak currencies paired against each other, so is likely to range, is New Zealand dollar. So remember how we discussed the euro potentially pushing into that high? Well, if the euro is going to push into the high, so too is likely going to be New Zealand dollar. But why trade a weak euro to the upside versus the dollar when you can trade the New Zealand dollar to the upside instead? That's the view going into next week. What I like about this is we've got this kind of consolidation and we've got strong momentum breakout here. You can see this, and now we're kind of flagging. So any pullback in this market is viewed as an opportunity to look for a breakout intra-week into the 0.6290. And this would be the profit taking zone. Why? Because there is a 70% chance priced by the markets of New Zealand dollar trading between these levels next week. And if we don't break out intra-week, we continue to come down, and we test the 0.61270, so we breach this, then this would be the second place next week. I'd be looking for a near-term buying opportunity in New Zealand dollar. Next is Euro New Zealand. Now I can either be short this market next week or do nothing. Buying this market is not an option. So what I'd like to see is, and you can see, we've got a big kind of bear flag setting up, choppy range here. Any pullback in this market is viewed next week as the opportunity to look for bearish reversals. down to the 1.7383. And if we fail to break out and we just trend all the way up and we take out these highs, this is going to be the second place next week above the 1.77250 that I would look for near-term short opportunities in Euro New Zealand. Next is Pound New Zealand. Now, this is a market after Euro New Zealand to the downside and New Zealand dollar that I do like. And you can see this has been quite a choppy market. Going into next week, I am going to be looking for any pullback, and you can look for intraweek breakouts to the downside because we may not pull all the way back to the 2.06370. So if it starts to go intra-week, you can always take intra-week trades down to the 2.02390. However, the setup that I would really like here next week, especially as we have clear lows being tested here, and then we have a new high over here, and we have highs over here, that every time we kind of breach these levels, we get pushed back down. So what I'd really like to see here, I think would be a great setup, is if we push above these highs and we start to trade into these lows above the 2.06370, this would be a great place that I'll start to look for a near-term short opportunity in Pound New Zealand next week. Moving on to the yen pairs, starting with US dollar yen, you can see we've had some big sell-offs in this market and we do have big momentum to the downside. I do like this, just keep in mind what we discussed at the beginning of the video with the Japanese yen. It may need to pull back lower first. I'm talking about the yen itself. And that, of course, would see the US dollar versus the Japanese yen push higher like this. So I really like the kind of bear flag setup that we're seeing here. Any kind of pullback and consolidation is viewed as an opportunity to look for intra-week breakouts down to the 139.89. Or, and the setups that I like, is if we pull back and we test the 144.470, so we breach this and perhaps we trade into this low over here, this would be the second place next week. I'd be looking for a near-term short opportunity in US dollar yen. The next yen pair I like to the downside is Euro yen. You can see again, we had this kind of sell-off, pullback, and now we're kind of consolidating. So any push higher next week, at the beginning of next week, is viewed as an opportunity to look for intra-week breakouts down to the 15260. And if we fail to break out intra-week and we just pull back and we pull back, and this actually is a really nice setup because you kind of have this A, B, and you have the higher low over here. And if we push up in this area and we take out not just the 157.35, but we also take out this high, this would be a great place next week to start to look for a near-term short opportunity. You also have the bottom of this over here, a near-term short opportunity to the downside in Euro yen. And the final yen pair I like is pound yen. You can see we are making lower lows and lower highs in this market. So again, really nice momentum here from the previous high. You can see this sell-off, and there's a very good chance momentum precedes price that we continue down next week. So any pullback is simply viewed as an opportunity to look for intra-week breakouts in this market down to the 177.71. Or if we fail to break out intra-week and we keep pulling back and we breach the 183.15, and even better, because the more we go above this, the kind of more overbought this is this week. If we breach this and we test resistance, and this is a fairly deep test, but if we push above this and test the previous high, this would be a great place, and there's a low over here as well. This area here would be a fantastic place next week where we run into resistance, and we're also overbought because we're above the 183.15. This would be a great place to look for a near-term short next week, given the opportunity in pound yen. Wrapping up the Forex markets with the Swiss franc pairs. Now, just bear in mind, I am looking at Swiss franc longs. In other words, the market we're looking here, US dollar franc to the downside primarily, but it is New Zealand longs and Japanese yen longs that we've already looked at that I prefer the most. The 6 markets we've already looked at are my favorite heading into next week, but the Swiss franc pairs are also on the watch list, just keeping an eye to see if we get some good setups. So any pullback in this market next week is viewed as an opportunity to look for a test of the upper bound 0.8778. If we start to break out intra-week, in other words, you can drop down to the 1 hour, and if we're pulling back and the market does this on the 1 hour and you get momentum like this intra-week and you break out, any pullback is an opportunity to look for shorts into the prior low and into the 0.8621. However, what I'd be looking for is if we can breach the 0.8778, and especially if we can breach this and test the prior high so we run into resistance, this would be a good place to start to look for near-term shorts next week in US dollar Swiss franc. Next is Euro Franc. Now this is a market, again, you can see the head and shoulders break over in this area. There's your lower high. And there's the break with momentum. We start to get this big sell-off as we break down. And all of the people who are buying this, they move their stop losses up. And then you have, don't forget, if you bought here, or you bought here, or you bought here, or anybody who bought here, they're moving their stop losses up. What's the stop loss? You're selling whatever you've bought. So you get all these kind of sell orders sitting below this low because all the buyers are moving their stop losses up. And then you get breakout traders coming in and adding sell orders on the break as well. It causes this kind of capitulation. And when you get this, you get the consolidation as people book profits over here, anybody who's short. But then you start to get continuation in that direction. You can see this. I mean, look at the difference between this leg down here, momentum, impulsive, pointing the direction of the next likely move here, technically speaking, and then the move against this, choppy and corrective. So any continued pullback in this area is viewed as an opportunity. I can either short this or do nothing. Buying this is not an option next week. It is viewed as an opportunity to look for a breakout of this consolidation correction down to the 0.9416 and possibly onto the prior low down here as well. However, a setup I also really like next week, especially as we have a high here and we have a high here, is if we can continue to push back, we can push above these two highs and we start to push above the 0.9552 roughly. This is going to be a great place because this is going to be overbought and trading into resistance next week. This is going to be a great place to look for near-term short opportunities in Euro Franc next week. And the final Forex pair is Pound Franc, probably my least favorite out of all of them. However, it is on the watch list. And what I'd like to see is we are starting to push higher. If we can continue up next week, you can start to look. It's kind of been ranging, down below these lows. And then we push up, take out this high, and then we start to push down. So I would be looking for a potential breakout intra-week down to the 1.0955. But because this is not a very, very weak currency or a very, very strong currency, and you can see it's kind of chopping, I'd probably prefer just to trade the range. So if we continue higher, instead of trading the intra-week, if we continue higher and we push above the 1.11280, and perhaps even this high over here would be perfect, that would be the opportunity and the place to start to look for a near-term sell-off and a short opportunity in Pound Franc next week. Okay, so wrapping up the video with gold and silver. Now, I do have a bullish bias on both of these heading into next week, but only because I do have a very near-term bearish bias on the dollar. I do actually think this is a major high that we've seen in gold. And part of the reason I think that is because I do think we are going to see the dollar heading higher into January and throughout January. So we're in this period where the dollar is actually heading towards a point where we can start to see it reversing higher, and gold has likely formed a major top. Now, in the near term, it does look like, as I said earlier on in the video, there's a little bit more left in the tank to the downside in the dollar, and therefore going into next week, and throughout December, there is probably a little bit more to the upside left on gold and silver. So what I'd like to see going into next week is we've already had this big momentum rally. Any continued pullback in this market is viewed as an opportunity to look for bearish breakouts intra-week into the 2063.76. And if we pull all the way back and we test the 2007.64, this would be the second place next week I'd look for a potential long opportunity in gold. I must admit, going into next week, I do think I favor the Forex markets with dollars in them, rather than gold and silver, personally speaking. And finally, we have silver. Again, there's a good chance that this is a major top, we will see, but we are getting momentum to the upside, and I think there's a little bit more upside. If you want to try and time the silver and gold longs next week, again, think of the New Zealand dollar and especially think of euro dollar. That high, which was highlighted in euro dollar, once we start to breach that, we could see some strength coming into the dollar. Therefore, if you're long silver or long gold, as we trade into that high in euro dollar highlighted at the beginning of the video, that could be a good place to start to look to book some profits. So going into next week, any continued pullback in this market is viewed as an opportunity to look for intra-week breakouts to the upside, into the previous high and onto the 24.87. And if we pull all the way back and we test the 23.43. This is the second place next week. I'll be looking for a near-term buy opportunity potentially in silver. So that is it from me for this week, guys. As always, I hope you enjoyed today's video, and if you did, why not consider joining us in the GMT training room each day, where I go through the best markets as well as sharing the real-time setups that I'm personally looking at trading with members as part of our GMT training program. Don't forget, anyone who signs up to GMT in December also gets the brand new Hedge Dash trading app completely free for 12 months. This offer expires at the end of December.